Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. I think post-COVID, I wish the attendance and my lectures were as good as this one. But we have a packed house, it's standing room only almost it seems, so welcome. Thank you for attending our talk. Yenni and I, we're talking about a subject that is very close to our heart, and in doing so, we're actually wearing two hats today. The first is our information systems and business hat. So we are academics in the School of Information Systems and the Business School. But the second hat that we're wearing is that we're both co-founders of what is called the Implementation Science Lab that was just established at the Business School, I think 2 weeks ago, right, Yenni? So we're here to tell you why we have basically founded the lab. Now, putting my information systems and business hat back on, right? I tell my students all the time that when you graduate from information systems, and indeed a lot of business disciplines, a lot of our students go out there to be problem solvers and also, to some extent, consultants, business analysts. That is the typical career path, especially in information systems. Now, as a business analyst or a consultant, what you do is you propose ideas to your clients, to the people that you work for. And in doing so, our client would typically execute a project. But the truth of the matter is, right, that we in information systems, we stop at the design of the idea. So we design an idea, we pass it on to someone else. And because we are not actually the people who implement the idea, we see the following things happening. According to research, 75% of all projects fail. 66% are over budget. A lot of projects, you would imagine, are also over time. Think about, for example, some of the large-scale infrastructural projects you see in Sydney, right? Things like the NBN, the light rail. These are not great examples of well-managed projects. In fact, research has shown us that out of 23% of all companies, right, only 23% of them actually achieve the benefits that they set out to achieve when they undertake a project. Now, this is a huge problem, of course, right? It just means that when you undertake a project, you're not achieving the benefits you've set out to achieve. But I wanted to talk about why it's like that. Well, the truth of the matter is that we as information systems or business professionals, when we go out there and we come up with a nice solution, we package it really well, and we give it to our clients. When we design that solution, it's done in a vacuum. So what this means is that, we have not considered all the potential things that have gone wrong. Even if we try to the best of our ability, right, there will inevitably be contextual factors that we neglect. And when we try to transpose this design solution in a vacuum, we try to put it into practice, we find that things inevitably go wrong. And we refer to this as the design practice gap. What we design does not fit the reality in practice. So what then is implementation science? Implementation science is really that, right? It's a technique, it's an approach to resolving that design practice gap. And what it really does is we try to make the act of implementation something that's scientific, something that's rigorously backed. What we do with implementation science is that implementation of any solution is not just a one-off thing, right? We study it, we measure it, and we try to make that better. So in the event that we have to implement a similar system or similar solution in another setting, we will do it better than we did the first time around. So a little bit about the history of implementation science. Implementation science has a long history. In business, our lab was set up 2 weeks ago. But implementation science has such a long history in the field of healthcare and health services especially. Because if you think about it, it makes sense, right? In healthcare or health services, if you get implementation wrong, it could be a matter of life and death. So for them, they're not like business people in healthcare and health services. They're focused with things that work. Business people, unfortunately, we tend to be more fixated with ideas and theories, and that is sometimes to our detriment. But we have a lot to learn from healthcare and health services. So Yenni, would you like to tell them about implementation science and the principles behind it.
Yes, so let's think about why implementation science matters to all of you. So we'll consider an example that is very relevant and common to today's professional world. A researcher comes up with a new strategy to help employees to improve on work-life balance. And the strategy is backed by years of research on organizational processes, culture, employee satisfaction, productivity, and so on. The strategy was also tested. So in controlled pilots, employees have reported increased job satisfaction and productivity. But what is really happening is when companies try to implement that strategy, they encounter a lot of challenges. So some employees might start to feel that, oh, I'm isolated from my team members when I'm working remotely, for example. Some managers, when they work with the flexible work hours and the remote working options, they find it challenging to support their team members. And this is just one very quick example to show you the relevance of implementation science, as the challenge that we have set up is exactly illustrating the research to practice gap that Barney was talking about. So it is about the misalignment between the research ideals and the practical realities. And implementation science is about bridging that gap, creating theories, models, frameworks, and solutions that can help us to make sure that the research we have spent years in developing will actually be put in good use. But how does it work exactly? So let's consider two real-life examples. Now you are leading a generative AI project in your company. So you are in charge of designing this new tool that will make everyone's life better. And you are an expert in some work processes, and you're going to use the generative AI tool to automate those processes. But in order for your tool to work, you do need to find ways to integrate it with the company's legacy systems that has been around for over a decade, and you need to be able to integrate it in a way that it minimizes disruptions to your colleagues, and ultimately you need to convince them to use the tool that you created and make sure all of them are trained to use it effectively. So think about this question. How many of us are actually excited when we are told to change the ways that we are used to just to accommodate a new tool? I don't think so, right? So it's something that most of us, I guess, dislike, and change is always painful. But the work of an implementation scientist is to make everyone's lives easier, to make the change process more effective. And there are several principles that guide their work. The first is implementation scientists always start with understanding the environment. Think about trying to redecorate your house. Without measuring the space you have, your new furniture might not fit, and you end up with a mess. It's exactly the same logic with implementation. When we are introducing a new idea, a new innovation, we need to understand the environment that we are introducing it. So that includes things like the company's culture, the people, the existing resources, the expertise, and even external factors, things like market trends, policies. Because as we all know, a new tool or a strategy that works in a startup environment might not work in a well-established organizations. So understanding your environment is the first step. The second step is to engage with your stakeholders. When you want to implement your AI tool, you need input from everyone who would be affected by that implementation. That includes the managers, the users, the IT people, even your client, if that's relevant. And that is essential because you need everyone's input to shape your design and implementation, and ultimately you will need their buy-in when you are ready to roll out. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is that the implementation science paradigm introduces us to a mindset shift. We need to look at implementation as an ongoing process. It is not a one-off event. It's very common for us to think about deploying a solution or handing it off to the users, and our job is done. But the reality is implementation is ongoing. So run your pilot tests, evaluate the outcomes, seek feedback from the stakeholders, improve your process, iterate until you are sure when it's time for the full-scale implementation, no one is in for a surprise.
And a point that Yenni and I would like to make is that implementation science is not just restricted to the corporate setting, right? It can work for pro-social, not-for-profit organizations and projects as well, right? Take, for example, a clean cook stoves project that could be especially relevant for rural, underdeveloped communities. Now, with rural and underdeveloped communities, they are typically cooking with dirty fuels, and of course they have to do that like 3 times a day to cook their meals. Now, if you imagine a project like that, right, and if you have someone who's tasked with solving this problem or issue for the people who are involved, you want to reduce indoor air pollution. You want them to stop burning dirty fuels when they're cooking. You want to improve their health outcomes as a consequence. Now, how would you go about doing this? Now, you, from your privileged background in Sydney, Australia, you might go, yeah, what's the cleanest way of cooking? Maybe I'll do it with an electric induction cooker. But if you bring this solution to the rural, underdeveloped community, the first question or the first challenge they might face is, where's the running electricity? Right? And you might go, okay, so there's no running electricity. I need to build the infrastructure to make this work. What am I going to power our electric induction cookers with? Maybe I'll put solar panels in, and then you start to expand your idea from there. But then the question is, firstly, is it feasible when you put your solution in place? And secondly, is it going to have the buy-in of the stakeholders involved? You might very well have someone come to you to say, we love the taste or the smell that cooking with this fuel adds to my cooking, right? If you don't cook with this, you cook with an electric induction cooker, it just doesn't taste right. You might have issues like that. But what's the moral of the story here? So with a project like this, right, even if you're looking to do something good, even if you're looking to solve the problem, there are multiple iterations that you need to go through. And as Yenni said, you need to understand the context, you need to assess, you need to engage with the stakeholders, you need to pilot the solution, and of course, continuously work with them, right, and adjust your approach so that what you end up with is a workable solution that achieves your intended aims, and it's just the people that you're trying to help actually buys into the solution that you've come up with. So in terms of measuring the success of projects, right, it is important to know that in implementation science, we're not just talking about short-term outcomes. Sure, those matter, right? When you're measuring the outcomes of each iteration of a project, you need to know if that iteration has been successful or not, because you need to adjust subsequently. But more importantly, you need to think long-term with implementation science projects. You need to set up strategic KPIs and ask yourself, after multiple iterations of this project, what is it am I exactly looking to achieve? So you need to think long-term and just beyond that single iteration. And this may come as a shock to many people who are project managers in reality, because in project management, we always say that it's a very dirty word if you say that my project has no defined end. We need a defined ending for a project, and we need people to sign off on it to say the project has concluded successfully. Well, implementation science says, right, and what we're trying to emphasize is you need to think beyond the scope of just a single project, because that project will reiterate. So overcoming implementation science challenges when we're working with our stakeholders, right, it simply means that we need to focus on 2 things. You need to ask yourself, has this project or this solution, is it already in place, right? Or is it very far off from what the stakeholders are expecting? Because if it's entirely new, then you will need to overcome almost this liability of newness, right? You will need to get them to anticipate and believe that this solution is a good enough or better alternative to what they're currently doing. And the other challenge is that if there's an existing way of doing things that has been there in place for many, many years. Now that's also another a different type of problem, because then there will be a lot of resistance to change that you may encounter. So then, to overcome these challenges, you will need change management techniques, right? You need to be able to demonstrate quick wins to show them the possibility of your solution. Because remember, right, to get someone to switch from what they're doing to that solution that you're proposing, it involves you being able to demonstrate that your solution is just as good, if not better. So you need to learn from failures and adapt continuously. Remember, right, implementation science projects are carried out in iterations.
So we are now living in an environment with plenty of opportunities, especially considering the technological advancements that, it's really rapidly bringing us a lot more possibilities. And our message of the talk today for you is, in order to succeed in your career, the ability to be able to recognize these opportunities, to identify the gaps, and to bridge them will be really, really important. And implementation science, as we move forward, will be more and more important and relevant. As young professionals, the ability to do this systematically, to understand and advance the science behind how to make things work, would be really beneficial. So the question is, how do you get ready? And the good news is, you can start right now. Be curious about the nuances in your environment. Be empathetic to the needs of different user groups. Be open to inputs that challenge your assumption, and be agile to adapt. Think outside the box of the possibilities offered by technology, and think about how you can implement your ideas and innovation like a researcher, like a scientist, based on strong evidence base. And if you are able to cultivate these mindsets and skills, you'll be ready for the professional world today. Thank you, everyone, for attending the talk.
Thank you, everyone.